Hi there. This is the second in Nodelcorp's series of videocasts on climate risk and resiliency. Today's topic is going to be tips and tricks choosing the right climate assessment tool. If you enjoy our videocasts, please feel free to subscribe by hitting the button below. Choosing the right risk assessment tool for a climate assessment can be very difficult. There are so many options available. It can be a very difficult question to answer. And in today's video presentation, I hope to take you through some of the considerations that we will generally go through in trying to get to a resolution as to which tool to use for very specific purposes. So for the first step in any of this is to decide about the context of your climate change risk assessment. I mean, basically, what is your plan? And in doing this, you need to have a very clear definition of what you mean by risk. There are various definitions of risk. This may seem like a fundamental question, but it's worth thinking about before you pick a tool to do your risk assessment, because the questions that the tool answers will be specific to the way it defines risk. ISO 31000, which has become a very common standard used in our climate risk assessment work, is an enterprise risk management standard, and it defines risk in terms of positive and negative outcomes. So it contemplates both positive and negative outcomes of a risk event. And it defines risk as effective uncertainty and objectives. And it measures risk typically in terms of likelihood times consequences. Consequences meaning something that could either be good or bad for your organization. Traditionally, we looked at risk in terms of possibility of loss or injury. This is commonly in the past the way we would have looked at risk from in an engineering perspective. And we would have defined or measured that risk in terms of probability times severity. Severity implying only negative outcomes from the event that we are contemplating. So these things are really worth considering. Now, when I look at risk, I like to think of it in terms of a standard quadrant of risk. And I'll explain over the next minute or two what I mean by that, and then show how that understanding can help you get a handle on which tool you may want to use for your climate risk assessment. So in a standard climate risk assessment, climate risk matrix, we tend to look at risk in terms of risk fields that are above and below these lines. So for example, risk analysis that's above the line is typically considered to be pure risk analysis, looking at only the negative outcomes of particular risk events. Those below the line would be speculative risk. Now, we all know speculative risk because I think many of us have on occasion purchased a lottery ticket, and we know how we weigh the balance between the $10 we put into the lottery and the potential outcome of $60 million, and what the likelihoods of those and what the consequences are. So we understand speculative risk in that perspective. Above the line, pure risk, we tend to look at hazard and operational risks. And the hazard risks tend to be negative outcomes that are affecting our infrastructure, our hardware, our business. Operational risks tend to be things that affect our people, our systems, the way we operate our work. Below the line, we tend to look at financial risk and strategic risk. These are both speculative risks. They could have positive or negative outcomes. If you have a strategic plan for the organization and it comes to fruition, it could be very positive outcomes for the organization. On the other hand, if it doesn't materialize, it doesn't go particularly the way you planned, there could be negative outcomes. So in our analysis of speculative risk, we'll tend to look at both the positive and the negative. Well, you'll need different tools to look at these different sorts of risks. For example, in climate change risk assessment, we would typically use a PIVC protocol sort of analysis to take a look at hazard risk. Joan and I were privileged to write the privacy protocol, and so we have a clear understanding of how it was tailored to address specifically hazard risks associated with infrastructure systems. The protocol can be used to take a look at somewhat at operational risks, but very typically is not used to take a look at financial or strategic opportunities for an organization. ICLEI-BARC, which is another tool that's commonly used in our field of work, tends to focus more on operational risks. So how's the organization function? How's it operating? Those sorts of things. Takes a little bit of a look at your hazard risks, and it also can take a little bit of a look at your strategic plans. But neither ICLEI-BARC nor PIVC tend to take a look at the financial aspects of your organizational risk. If you wanted to focus primarily on strategic risk, there are traditional tools for doing that, such as SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is something that we've used often in the past to take a look at strategic risks, and is quite commonly used across many industries for this purpose. And in financial risk, we would use standard financial analytical techniques, doing cash flow analysis, taking a look at net present values, internal rates of return, and risk biasing those calculations to get a sense of our valuation of the risk and what that has impact that will have on our financial risk outcomes. Well, these are only 4 tools. There are many. ISO 31010 provides a compilation of over 30 different risk assessment techniques that can be applied, many of them quite usefully in climate change risk assessment work, which we have done. Each of them tailored to a specific sort of risk activity. So is it hazard, is it operational, is it strategic, or is it financial? So if you are contemplating different ways of taking a look at your climate change risk, I encourage you to pop on over to ISO's website and take a look at ISO 31010. I'll provide a link in the information section below for that. Ultimately, to choose the tool, you need to focus on what objectives you are trying to achieve with your analysis. What sorts of risks are in the analysis? What sorts of risks are out? These things will define the appropriate tool to use to do the assessment. What sort of data do you have? And that will decide whether you are going to use more of a qualitative approach or if you have sufficient data to do more of a quantitative analysis of your risk. And finally, what do you hope to deliver out of all of this? What are the questions you're trying to answer? Because each tool will answer specific sets of questions, and it is important to understand what those questions are, what you're trying to achieve, and that will help you select which tool to use. When asked by my clients, I typically will tell them, don't force fit. Don't pick a tool simply because everybody else is using that particular tool to do their analysis. Pick the tool that best answers the questions that you need to ask. And if you need some help at deciding what that might be, I mean, you can feel free to ask. There are folks out here who are happy to provide you input on those sorts of questions. So ultimately, select the tool that best fits the application that you are in and answer the questions that you specifically have. At the end of the day, it's your risk, it's your questions, so pick a tool that answers the questions that you have, not a tool that forces you to answer the questions it has. With that, I'll complete today's presentation. If you have enjoyed this, please click the subscribe button below and feel free to join us next time. We'll see you again. See you next time.